First, we will have Daniel Hinshaw, who is a residential fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study. He is Professor Emeritus of Surgery. He has very interesting projects at the Institute, but he has extensive experience in matters Orthodox and has been a consultant in many respects there. Andrei Ivanov is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, also at the Institute for Advanced Study at Notre Dame. He was 2 years at Boston College as a visiting assistant professor in the history department. He specializes in the religious, cultural, and social history of the Russian Empire. And our very own Yury Avvakumov, who is a Nanovic Fellow, but he is also Associate Professor of Theology here at Notre Dame, specializing in the history of Christianity. So I think what we'll do is we'll see some PowerPoint presentations first from Mr. Hinshaw, and then we'll move through in that order, Andrei and Yury. So enjoy.
I should say by way of disclosure that that I am a sessional professor at the St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary, which was definitely linked to the Russian emigres that came through Paris in the 1920s. And so there is a Slavic connection there with a strong Russian flavor. I also teach at the St. John of Damascus Theological Faculty in Balamand University in Lebanon, which is under the Patriarch of Antioch. So, but while I've been here locally, I've been attending a Greek Orthodox parish. So I'm trying to be as ecumenical within the faith as I can. I'm thrilled that Notre Dame is a center for Alexander Solzhenitsyn studies. About a week ago, there was a wonderful conference dedicated to his 100th birthday. And I thought I should apologize or beg your forgiveness for any of my limitations as I present this material, and also emphasize that I think an operational principle here that applies to all of us discussing it, but also the main hierarchs within the Orthodox tradition also applies to them and to the laity involved. Solzhenitsyn's famous statement from his Gulag Archipelago, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. So one thing I wanted to kind of suggest, because I'm not emphasizing so much the historical aspect, but some of the tradition that, the living tradition within the Orthodox worshiping community, and what the basic Orthodox ecclesiology has been. It's obviously developed over the centuries, and I'll try to give some sense of that quickly. But a fundamental principle within the Eastern Church is that the local church represents the fullness of the universal Catholic Church. So if every Orthodox parish or every Orthodox community were suddenly obliterated, but there was one bishop and the community that was surrounding that bishop, from the Orthodox perspective, the fullness of the Catholic Church would still be there. The other important principle is that there is unity within the divine liturgy, within the Mass. And this is a quote from St. Ignatius of Antioch, who died as a martyr. This is an icon showing him being eaten by lions in Rome. Take heed then to have but one Eucharist, for there is one flesh of our Lord Jesus Christ, and one cup to show forth the unity of his blood, one altar as there is one bishop, along with the presbytery and deacons. So this is another fundamental principle within the Orthodox faith. And these are two principles that I'll come back to at the end of my remarks as I try to tie this together. Now, what's happened over time? Well, during the time or period when the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, and in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire, they developed what has been referred to as a symphonia, a pre-modern symphonia of the Church, and this is based on the common origins of both the Church and the state as God's gift to mankind, suggesting they're ideally harmonious functioning for the sake of society and its members. And of course, within the history of the church, that harmonious working has had its problems. One of the most famous archbishops of Constantinople, for example, died in exile after he came into conflict with the Empress Eudoxia at the end of the 4th century, St. John Chrysostom. There's been more conflict, probably, or dramatic types of conflict between the church hierarchy and the Roman imperial authority in the East than sometimes I think we really recognize in the West. The symphony has been a cacophony at times. Now, what happens though with this is, as during that time when the symphony occurred, even though this principle of one bishop representing the entire Catholicity of the church, certain imperial dioceses became affiliated or administratively connected in ways where they had provincial authorities. So there were the metropolitanates, and then eventually, initially 3 patriarchates: Rome, Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria as the earliest ones, and then later Jerusalem, because of its antiquity, was given an honorific, as well as Constantinople following. When the Eastern Roman Empire fell in 1453, and this mosaic that you see here, I've seen this in person. I was a pilgrim at one point to the Fener. This is in Istanbul, and this is the headquarters of the Ecumenical Patriarch. And that's a full-sized mosaic showing the conqueror of Sultan Mehmet, who conquered Constantinople, delegating authority, not only recognizing the religious authority of the Archbishop of Constantinople, in this case Gennadios, but also some kinds of administrative authority over this ethnic population. So you start to see this evolution towards an ethnic religious fusion under the Ottomans. And this is a very successful way that they subjugated minority populations within their empire. And now, some recent scholars have referred to what has somehow evolved after the fall of communism into something, instead of the symphonia earlier, it's a symphonic secularism. And so, while there is officially a separation of church and state in most Eastern European countries, including post-Soviet Russia, there still is a special consensual relationship that exists in which the Orthodox Church, wherein the majority enjoys certain benefits, greater influence with the state, some state patronage, and some of this is played out in ways that Christians maybe could identify with. So the traditional definitions of marriage, for example, have been preserved in places like Russia. This is a picture of the president of Romania and the Patriarch of Romania, Daniel. By the way, the president of Romania is a German extraction. He's not Orthodox, but he's dutifully sitting there while the Orthodox Patriarch is blessing the state in an official function. So where the Orthodox have been in a dominant demographic position, for example, in Romania, about 85% of the population Orthodox, they have played this other kind of role, which has enhanced the political, ethnic fusion, and also accelerated or exacerbated, for some of us in the West who are Orthodox converts, a nationalism that's been fused to Orthodoxy, to the point where the cart of the national ethnic identity too often goes before the horse of the universal faith, where, St. Paul said, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, nor free, but Christ is all in all. So how does this relate to current relationships? So this is, again, quoting from a very nice article by an author named Macreades. When the Patriarchate of Antioch had, through the Russian intervention, passed into Arab Orthodox hands in 1898, this represented a major watershed for the Arabs in the Middle East who were Orthodox, because the Russian Church in the 18th century intervened with the military might of the Russian Empire to protect monastic communities and other Orthodox parishes in the Levant when they were being threatened with active persecution under the Ottomans, to the extent that military action was threatened. And so when you would visit monasteries, for example, in Lebanon, you can see the continuing examples of Russian iconography and other things that were introduced during the late 18th century and early 19th century in the Levantine areas. And so this was a major breakthrough from the standpoint of the Arab Orthodox, that they finally started to gain ascendancy in this historic Patriarchate of Antioch. To this day, though, there's only one bishop in the Jerusalem Patriarchate that is Palestinian of origin. All of the rest are Greek. The Alexandrian Patriarchate is also controlled by the Greeks. And so there's a lot of ill feeling amongst the different ethnic jurisdictions because of a kind of a dominance of the Greeks, in which they have trying to Hellenize the church at the same time that they, and this comes from the Ecumenical Patriarch himself to a certain extent. Now, what about this relationship? Because I'm supposed to speak a little bit on behalf or in defense of the Russians. Well, I wanted to give you an example of the Serbian Orthodox Church. They grieve because their ancestral, the spiritual lands around Kosovo, where the great battle in the late 14th century was fought, which was sort of the spiritual crucifixion of the Orthodox Serbian people and their land, there's a connection there that is hard for us to recapitulate in the West, I think. But they have this strong sense of there are monastic communities there and so on. And I think the same thing, of course, exists maybe even more strongly within the Russian tradition, that they come from the same roots as their Ukrainian brothers and sisters, originating from the Kievan Rus. And so there's this sense of common spiritual heritage and a fear of some kind of separation. Although obviously in the last 200, 300 years, there's been an increasing tendency toward developing more of a national identity with the emergence of nation states, again, because of the Orthodox Church's own mistakes, I think, in this regard. They've tended to identify more and more with individual nation states, and so it's a natural thing to see the Ukrainian people wanting to have a Ukrainian church that has more than autonomy but autocephaly. The distinctions there are subtle, but autocephaly would mean an equal footing with the Russian Patriarchate, for example. An autonomous church would be essentially free, except that the sponsoring church would still have a say in their hierarchy, their bishops being determined. So my question, though, is what is more important, nationalistic fervor or the unity of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? And this is what threatens, I think, something that's more profound about the Orthodox or about Christian faith in general. And so I wanted to just make my final observation is there's a very fine appeal to conciliarity, which is or sobernost, which is the Slavic term for it, where in the Orthodox tradition, because each bishop is equal, including setting aside the patriarchal titles and so forth, recently in October, the Patriarch of Antioch, which is on the right-hand side, Patriarch John, and then Patriarch Irenei of Serbia, got together and they put together a document appealing to the Patriarch of Ecumenical Patriarch to step back from what is perceived within a large part of the Orthodox world as a unilateral decision on his part. These kinds of decisions about the fate of another Orthodox community really requires the entire church to be engaged with it. So the rest of the Orthodoxy is currently in communion with the elements of the Orthodox Church that are under the Moscow Patriarchate in the Ukraine. And what has happened now is that with the Ecumenical Patriarch unilaterally deciding to recognize a schismatic group, this has created a significant rupture. Has this happened before? Yes. Most of these efforts to achieve autocephaly have been messy. And so this may eventually achieve the goals of the Ukrainian people who are hoping to become an autocephalous Orthodox Church, but it's going to be ugly in the meantime. And it's really important, I think, to return to a conciliar approach. So I'm just going to emphasize again, the Church is not a federation or a confederation of churches. It is the one Catholic Church in unity throughout these different regions. And so I just wanted to finally say that, again, and I highlighted here at the end of my slides, is that the other major patriarchates of the Orthodox Church are offering to work through fraternal assistance to mend this rupture between the Russian Church and the Ecumenical Patriarch. But this has to be done with all of them involved. And just one last quick thing. In 2016, there was an attempt to have an ecumenical council of the Eastern churches in Cyprus, which was not ecumenical. The Russian Church was not there. Antioch wasn't there because of a number of issues I don't have time to go into. But just to emphasize that they need to go back to first principles. I better stop there. I think I'm over my time. Thank you.
Should I get this one? Or I'll take this one. Oh, sorry. Sitting on a lower chair is not a sign of humility. I just had a mid-foot sprain, so sitting on there might not be very stable. So I'm going to go over some historical background of the relationship between Constantinople and Moscow over the issue of Ukraine and how it led up to the crisis. So all of the Slavic lands to the east of Vistula were the mission field of the Archbishopric of Constantinople. So the baptism of the Rus, the baptism of the Eastern Slavs, of Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, took place originally in 988. It was done by decree from Grand Prince Vladimir, known as Vladimir the Great. So I'm going to go in the next 10 minutes from Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin. And it was essentially done by dunking the pagans in the water and hoping that they come out of it good Christians. So that's how the conversions of pagans worked in early medieval Europe in general. Over the time, these lands turned from being pagan to being fully Christian, and the lands that we know today as Russia or Muscovy became the vassal states of the Golden Horde, the successor state of Genghis Khan's empire, while Ukraine and the areas where Kievan Rus was established, the original baptism, became part of Poland. And so here we have Muscovy and Ukraine on the slide. Now, Kiev, the capital of Ukraine today, had its own metropolitan that was appointed by Constantinople. But in 1431, Constantinople decided to engage in dialogue with Rome to seek a union. This was known as the Union of Florence. And at this point, the Grand Prince of Muscovy, Vasily the Blind, cursed Constantinople and anathemized all Greeks who decided to unionize with Rome, who decided to abandon Orthodoxy and become unionists with Rome. And so at this point, Moscow decided that they had their own authority to appoint a metropolitan. And appointed in 1448 after the condemnation of the Council of Florence. And this is from this point on, Moscow has its own metropolitans. Now, the problem was that the Metropolitan of Moscow had the title of Metropolitan of Kiev. And there was another metropolitan in Kiev that was in Ukraine. So you had two metropolitans of Kiev from this period on until 1586, when the Patriarch of Constantinople, Jeremiah II, decided to anoint Moscow Metropolitan as the Patriarch of Moscow. So now you don't have the confusion anymore. You have the Metropolitan of Kiev in Kiev, and then you have the Metropolitan of Moscow now has the title of Patriarch of Moscow and all the Rus. So that was the beginning of the Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church, meaning that it has its own full independence from Constantinople. More things happened in Ukraine. The Independence War of 1654, when the Ukrainian hetmanate decided to seek independence and then confederated itself with Russia. Later on, Russia absorbed hetmanate as essentially part of Russia, but at this point it was a confederation. And in 1686, Patriarch Dionysius of Constantinople issued a tomos allowing the Russian Tsars to appoint metropolitans of Kiev and to supervise, for the Russian patriarchs to supervise the 3 dioceses of Ukraine. So not the whole Ukraine, but those 3 dioceses of the left bank Ukraine were given to Moscow. Moscow abolishes its own patriarchate in 1721 because of the Reformation influence, and Peter the Great adopts a Swedish consistorial synodal model. And so Russia becomes a synodal, a Holy Synod, not a patriarchate, and that continues until 1917 for the existence of the Russian Empire. And the Holy Synod essentially controls these areas that were given to it by Constantinople, and that it itself expanded. But the Russian Empire was not static, it expanded. So, and it expanded primarily in the south, in the areas that were Ottoman Empire. And these areas that were Ottoman Empire were under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So the areas that today we have Odessa in Ukraine, or Simferopol in Ukraine, or areas like Mariupol and Donetsk in Ukraine, these areas were originally just part of the Ottoman Empire. But all of a sudden now, they are part of the Russian Empire. So the Russian government starts establishing new eparchies, new dioceses in this area. And for example, one of the famous bishops was Gavril Benulescu Bodoni, was appointed as Exarch of Moldova and Bessarabia. And that Moldova, Bessarabia is that area there in the left that you see on the map here. Constantinople, Patriarch Neophyte, had cursed and anathemized Gavril Benulescu Bodoni. Despite that, the Moldovan Orthodox Church had canonized him as a saint. So Saint Gavril today is a saint in Moldova and Russia, but he is a anathemized heretic in Constantinople. So there was a friction between these new bishops that Russia was putting in the former areas of Ottoman Empire. But Russia won the war against the Ottoman Empire in 1774, the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarcha. And what did this treaty specify? It specified that Russia was now the official protector of all Christians in the Ottoman Empire, including Lebanon. So Lebanon became part of the area that Russia had jurisdiction to protect. This only changed with the Crimean War when France became the official protector of Christians in Lebanon. And then Russia came back in 1878, but that's a different question. So that's why you see the French and the Russian influence in Lebanon, because Russia was official protector in the Ottoman Empire. The Russian Empire collapses in 1917. It ceases to exist. And so all of those areas that were part of the Russian Empire, from Helsinki to San Francisco and really to New York, which was canonically part of the Russian Orthodox Church, they are now suddenly in disarray. There's chaos all over the place, complete disruption, complete disintegration of the Russian Orthodox Church after the Bolshevik Revolution. So what happens during this time is that the Russians is trying to scramble whatever remains of the Orthodox Church as they're being persecuted by the Soviets. They're trying to scramble some kind of order. And so they appoint the former Archbishop of San Francisco in New York, Tikhon Belavin, as the new Patriarch of Moscow, but then he dies and Russia doesn't have patriarchate anymore until Stalin allows it in 1944. So there's continuous disruption and chaos going on. So in this chaos, the former parts of Russian Empire, like Finland, decide that they're going to have their own Orthodox Church. Since Russian Empire doesn't exist anymore, we need to organize somehow. Let's have our own Orthodox Church. In Poland and in Western Ukraine, Constantinople Patriarch Gregory VII realized this disruption. You know, the Polish Orthodox needed some kind of authority, and because there was no authority coming in from Stalin's Russia, Constantinople decided that Polish Orthodox Church now has autocephaly, it has its own independence from Moscow. Now, Moscow didn't grant the independence to Poland or Western Ukraine, but you know, there was no really authority in Moscow to speak of. Now, another thing that Gregory did is he questioned 1686. He questioned 1686 as whether it was valid to give Ukraine to Russian Patriarchate, and that created more problems down the road. So from 1917 to 2017, we're still dealing with a disruption caused by the Bolshevik Revolution. We're still in it today. In Estonia today, we have a body of Orthodox believers who are part of Constantinople Patriarchate. They only recognize Constantinople as their head, and they control most of the buildings in Estonia. Most of the believers in Estonia, however, are part of this group called the Estonian Orthodox Church that is part of Moscow Patriarchate. So we have a division between Orthodox believers either recognizing Moscow or recognizing Constantinople. In Moldova, we have division between the Christians who, Orthodox Christians who are part of the Patriarchate of Bucharest, because Moldova was part of Romania for a long period of time. And the Patriarchate of Bucharest also claims parts of Ukraine, like Bukovina and southern Odessa, as part of Romanian Orthodox jurisdiction. Patriarchate of Moscow claims the Russian-speaking churches. So if you go to Moldova, you can go to an Orthodox church, and then this church will be Russian-speaking or Church Slavonic, and they will be part of the Moscow Patriarchate. And other churches you'll see will be Romanian-speaking. They'll be part of Romanian Patriarchate in one country. USA is another example. It used to be that the territory of USA was largely under the jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church up until 1917. And the Russian Orthodox Church appointed bishops in USA. Now, after the empire ceased to exist, you now have the Antiochian Patriarchate claiming its authority in USA, Constantinople, and various other groups. But there is the group, the Orthodox Church in America, the oldest group, the oldest Orthodox group that has the blessing from Moscow to be an autonomous church. So what happened in Ukraine? Similar dynamic. Ukraine proclaims independence. You have dissolution of the Soviet Empire. Soviet Empire ceases to exist. What happens to the Orthodox Church? You have three Orthodox denominations in Ukraine. One is called the Patriarchate of Kiev. It was started by Filaret, who argues that Ukraine needs to have an independent national church, and that he needed no permission. This was up until recently. He just sort of proclaimed himself the Patriarch of Kiev, and that's all that we need, is separation. The second one is Patriarchate of Moscow, Onufry, the Metropolitan of Kiev, who claims that in order to achieve independence for Ukrainian church, we have to ask permission from Moscow. So Filaret says we don't need any permission from Moscow. Onufry says we need permission of Moscow. And so you have the Patriarchate of Moscow through Onufry. And then we have Makary Miletich, who is the Metropolitan of Ukraine and Kiev, but who is claiming to be part of Constantinople Patriarchate. Now, up until this year, these were three rival groups, two of them not recognized by Constantinople or Moscow. They were viewed as schismatics up until this year. And these two groups were reflecting a larger movement in Ukraine for a national church. It's a very vibrant, real movement. A lot of people want to have a national church. The question is, how do you come to that? How do you find a process to have a national church together, all Ukrainian believers to have their church? And so after the independence, there were several attempts by the state to intervene into this process. Most recent attempt was fairly successful, as this year, the president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, had issued a request to Constantinople to intervene and issue some kind of a ruling to call for a council of all Ukrainian believers to elect their new leadership and to finally solve this crisis and unite all Ukrainian believers together. There are questions about church-state relations here, just like in Putin's Russia. There's fear that in Ukraine the state will now dictate who keeps the church and so on. In Ukrainian parliament right now, there are people who are calling for Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate to ban their name, because their name has Ukrainian Orthodox Church in it, but they're part of Moscow Patriarchate. So can the state ban the church's name? Now, that's a big question. In the United States, we have separation of church and state. So President Trump cannot ban the name of Southern Baptists. If they want to rename themselves into Western Baptists, they could do that, right? It doesn't matter. But in Ukraine, it's a big deal. If if a church has the name Ukrainian in it or not. So on 11th of October, this is penultimate slide here, Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople withdraws 1686 decision. That's a big deal because that decision was there for several hundred years. And so what it means now is that all of the churches in Ukraine are now part of Constantinople jurisdiction, according to Constantinople, according to Bartholomew's view. All of the churches are now part of his parish, and now the churches need to get together and find common ground and also elect a head of the new church. Now, if the majority of Ukrainian bishops do that, if the majority of Ukrainian bishops get together, convene an assembly, and choose their own independent ruler or patriarch or archbishop, Vladimir Putin had threatened to intervene militarily. He raised this issue at the Council of State National Security. So this is something that's very serious. So the question is, will the bishop of Ukraine do that or not? Now, the Patriarch of Russia, Kirill, Moscow, following that announcement, broke Eucharistic relations with Constantinople. So Constantinople and Moscow no longer have Eucharistic relations, meaning somebody from one church cannot have communion in another church. And Bartholomew is accused of neo-papism. Now, why? The crux of the matter is the question of primacy of honor versus primacy of power. The Patriarch of Constantinople is ecumenical. He's the only patriarch who has ecumenical in his title. The question is he ecumenical like the Pope, meaning he can issue any decision over any jurisdiction sort of to override that the other patriarchate's jurisdiction, or is he equal just in his sort of honor? It's an honorific thing. Is he ecumenical in his honor, and then in terms of power, all patriarchates are equal. And the Moscow Patriarchate claims that Bartholomew is only ecumenical in name, in honor. He doesn't have the power to override other patriarchs. So the primacy of honor versus the primacy of power is one of the big issues of the accusations of neo-papism against Bartholomew. Thank you very much.
So I decided to scribble down a couple of thoughts and to write from the text because I was afraid that the free-floating might lead me to speak for too long. So I'll try to stick to my text. Let me start by pointing to the fact that the current disagreement and conflict between Constantinople and Moscow, which has attracted much attention in the media in the West for a news in ecclesiastical area. Let us be honest, mostly because of the two grand players involved, particularly Moscow, of course, but also Constantinople. That this conflict is actually no more than a tip of an iceberg, a huge iceberg that remains largely unseen, unknown, ignored, and misunderstood by the public and the media in the West. This ignored and misunderstood iceberg is Ukraine, Ukrainian Christians. Ukraine is the core, the center, the heartland that now sets the stage for tectonic developments in Eastern and world Christianity. In my view, we shall never be able to understand the issues involved in the current conflict without a serious, well-informed, and thoughtful engagement with Ukraine and its Christianity. It is disappointing and at times disheartening to observe how little knowledge and understanding there is today in the West, if we may use this term, of Ukraine, its culture, and its religion. religion that goes back to the 9th and 10th centuries. Despite some moderate progress in academic and intellectual circles, who in the 2 recent decades slowly began to gain at least some public awareness of Ukraine, there is still very much work to be done in order to overcome the predominance of the long outdated, anachronistic, I would even say archaic, official imperial Russian historical narrative that purposefully distorts the picture of Ukrainian religious past and present, and in effect robs Ukrainians of their sovereignty and independence. Let me confess that my own interest in and enthusiasm for the history of Ukrainian Christianity and its complicated relations with Muscovy and Russia owes much to my Russian origins. Russia is the country in which I was born and grew up, and I know Russian Christianity not from without, but from within. Ukraine is the country in which I have lived and served academically, which I got to know, to respect, to value, to love, and I hope to understand. I will try to delineate 3 aspects: pastoral, political, and public, attempting to show why Constantinople's decision to recognize the uncanonical, quote unquote, churches, Orthodox churches, is, in my view, appropriate, well considered, and guided by pastoral concerns. Let's begin with pastoral aspect. Here is the diagram showing the distribution between different Orthodox churches in Ukraine. Ukraine is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multi-confessional country, and what is even more important, it is predominantly an ecumenically minded country, a country of tolerance in religious sphere. You have been already introduced by the colleague into the fact of the existence of 3 different jurisdictions, 3 different Orthodox churches in Ukraine. And here is some statistics. There are 3 Orthodox churches in Ukraine, the one of the Kievan Patriarchate, KP on the slide, of the Moscow Patriarchate, MP, so you see UOCKP, Kievan Patriarchate, UOCMP, Moscow Patriarchate, and the church which is known as Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, UAPC on this slide. You see that the Moscow Patriarchate has the greatest, the highest number of the dioceses and of parishes. However, the number of the faithful, the proportion is different. All estimations are can be questioned in principle because there is no parish statistics in any of the Orthodox churches in these regions. Now, 2 of the 3 Orthodox churches prior to October 11, 2018, the date of the decision of the Patriarchate of Constantinople that we are discussing, were considered uncanonical by the world Orthodoxy. This means that at least 9 million Orthodox Ukrainians have been living without recognition by the world Orthodoxy. The reason was the position of the Moscow Patriarchate, who declared and still declares these churches uncanonical and schismatic, and their leaders excommunicated. Not only declares these churches uncanonical, but it does not recognize their sacraments, including baptism. From the Moscow point of view, those who are baptized in the Kievan Patriarchate are not baptized. Let me provide one example out of many. About a year ago, in January 2018, a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate refused to conduct a burial of a child who was baptized in the Kievan Patriarchate. This was widely reported in Ukrainian and even in world Christian media and raised a nationwide outrage. At the same time, it should be clear that there is absolutely no dogmatic or liturgical difference between the churches, except for the usage of modern Ukrainian in the liturgy, perhaps. Yeah. The Kievan Patriarchate and the Autocephalous Church are predominantly using modern Ukrainian in their liturgy. This unnatural situation has lasted since the very beginning of Ukrainian independence in 1991, that is for at least 26 years now. And there has been practically no moves on part of the Moscow Patriarchate, not only towards recognition, but even towards some form of a dialogue with the alleged schismatics. Now, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I, has made a pivotal step. He has recognized these Christians and their ecclesial structures. They are no longer schismatics, the non-existent ones. They are parts of the world orthodoxy, even if not yet orderly structured and in the process of formation, but nevertheless. The step that Bartholomew has made on October 11 is marked by a positive content. It is not directed against anyone. The Patriarch did not issue any accusations or condemnations. He did not call for a division. It is a positive step through and through, a hand stretched toward Christian sisters and brothers in Ukraine. The reaction that comes from the leadership of the Moscow Patriarchate to the country is purely negative and divisive. Particularly disturbing is, as I mentioned, the political moves to discredit Patriarch Bartholomew personally. Let me now address the political aspect. Here we must clearly see the broad political picture. Without it, no understanding of the pastoral aspects is possible. At least two political factors should be kept in mind. The first is the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity that occurred in 2013, 2014 on the Maidan, central square in Kiev, mass public protests that led to the deposition of the government. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were protesting against cronyism, nepotism, bribes, criminal ties of the government, suppression of independent media, corrupt legal system, public lies, and cynicism, disrespect for human dignity, and the authoritarian style of the pro-Russian President Yanukovych and the ruling party, the Party of Regents. In the eyes of millions of Ukrainians, Russia, in its present condition, embodied these vices of the political system. The pro-Russian government, with the advice and help of its backers in Moscow, attempted to suppress the protests brutally. This is how Maidan looked like after this. More than 100 people were killed by the riot police and snipers. President Yanukovych, who was responsible for the mass shootings in February 2014, fled from Ukraine to Russia. Ukrainian churches, lay activists, priests, bishops supported the protests and were present on the Maidan with the people throughout, including its most tragic days when dozens of people were killed. Here are a couple of slides showing priests of different churches, Orthodox and Catholic churches on the Maidan, protecting people by themselves. Burial of those killed. And this is a picture of the shelter that was given by the main church of the Kievan, one of the main churches of the Kievan Patriarchate, to the people, Mikhailivsky Sobor, to the participants of these protests. And here we come to the second political factor that contributed to the decision of Patriarch Bartholomeus, the ongoing war of Russia against Ukraine. Immediately after the Revolution of Dignity, the Kremlin unleashed a war of retaliation against Ukraine and Ukrainians. The Crimea and considerable parts of Ukrainian territory in the east, they are shown here in red, have been captured by the Russian troops. Let us also zoom in a little bit. And by the way, there is also, you have this information on the slide that more than 400 kilometers of the border between Russia and Ukraine is not in control of Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian government now. Now zooming in into these eastern regions of Ukraine and taking a look at the east, particularly we can see different types of weapons employed by Russia. And here is the statistics. I think I must read this. 10,000 casualties since 2014, 1.6 million displaced persons. Currently, there are about 10 to 40 bombardments and shootings of Ukrainian territory from the territory occupied by Russia, about 1 to 10 casualties, and about 1 to 20 wounded daily. Daily. The war is ongoing. Every day, people are being killed on the Russian-Ukrainian border. We don't hear anything in the media here, regrettably, about it. Overall, in proximity to Ukrainian border, there are about 260,000 Russian troops, 3.5 thousand panzers, 11,000 armored vehicles, and 4,000 artillery systems. Against this background, the desire of Christians in Ukraine to liberate themselves from any influences coming from Moscow, including ecclesiastical influences, becomes more than understandable. Let me explain about the ecclesiastical side of the story. Particularly detrimental for the reputation of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine has been the fact that the Moscow church leaders never uttered a word, not only not a word of condemnation, but also not a single, even mildly critical word about the actions of the Russian government and its military. Quite the opposite. The church leaders and a considerable part of the clergy willingly provided justifications for these actions and acted and still act unambiguously as ideological instrument of the Russian expansion. An example which, out of a lot of examples, but here is just an example that provoked public outrage in Ukraine. The entire Ukrainian parliament and representatives of NGOs and churches stand up in honor to honor the memory of the victims of the war, except the three hierarchs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. It was Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, not the political leadership of Russia actually, who first began to publicly promote the idea of the Russian space. The ideological construct meant to embrace Russians and Russian-speaking people over the entire planet, all of them belonging, from the standpoint of the Russian Orthodox Church, to the area of the pastoral care of the Moscow Patriarchate, be it in actu or in potentia. That Ukrainians and Belarusians were seen as primarily members of the Russian space, or sometimes you hear Russian world. But in one of the recent articles by George Weigel, I think he provided a very good and appropriate translation of this. It's actually Russian space. I think it's a good translation. That Ukrainians and Belarusians were seen as primarily members of the Russian space alongside with Russians became clear during Kirill's frequent visits to Ukraine in 2008-2012, when the slogan, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the one holy Rus, was publicly recited at mass rallies gathered to greet him. Politically, this slogan meant, in effect, the denial of Ukrainian and Belarusian independence. Ecclesiastically, it meant that, according to Kirill, Christianity in all three countries should be under the power of the Patriarchal Moscow. Actually, I think revanchist and militarist features of the RS Russia, Russian space, RS Russia, betray its ideological kinship with NS Germany, calling into memory the Anschluss of Austria and the occupation of the Sudetenland in 1938. Today, the idea of the protection, if deemed necessary, with military means of the imagined members of the Russian space across the globe causes tensions and conflicts between Russia and most of its neighbors, particularly with those who themselves seek to escape from the shadow of Kremlin's autocratic and corrupt regime. Only 4 years after Kirill's mentioned visits to Ukraine, propagating Russian space, the Russian space, the idea of the Russian space served as a pretext and ideological legitimation of Russia's annexation of Crimea, which, as Putin declared, possessed a sacred meaning for the Russians, and of the military intervention in eastern regions of Ukraine. The leadership of the Moscow Patriarchate, I'm not speaking about the church as the community of Christians and as the community of believers, but the leadership of the Moscow Patriarchate is an active public promoter of this toxic and highly dangerous idea of Russian space on the international area. One example, again, out of many. Here's a picture of Patriarch Kirill and the two propagandists of the Russian space ideology on the state TV and radio channels, who just have been decorated by Kirill with highest ecclesiastical awards. The one on the left, by the way, Kiselyov, has become particularly notorious due to his public threat in a primetime political show on the first national TV channel to turn the United States into radioactive ashes. В radioactively people, it says here, this is the screenshot. This growing aversion of Ukrainians against the Moscow Patriarchate, which can be very well seen on this diagram, you can see that the number of the people who associate themselves with the Moscow Patriarchate is constantly decreasing, while the number of the people who associate themselves with the Kievan Patriarchate is constantly increasing. This aversion clearly possesses a political dimension, of course. However, there is much more at stake here, much more than politics in the sense of geopolitical power plays as it is predominantly understood in contemporary Russia. And here we come to the final, public aspect, which leads us to the foundations of Christianity, actually, and to theological aspects. Russian ideologists and propagandists today are touting their version of Christianity as the only true one. Russian Orthodoxy has become an indispensable component of the Russian space ideology, which has proven to be a source of military conflict, blood, and war. Ukrainians have confronted the serious challenge with a quest for a different Christianity, for the Christianity of liberty, human rights and human dignity, and civil society. I just wanted to present this slide, this picture that I like very much. This is a picture of from the early days of the protests on the Maidan. Most exclusively young people. Just look, dwell on this picture, please, a little bit. Just look at the faces. Here are the faces of the young Ukrainians struggling for their rights and independence. And by the way, the inscription there, these are the students from to a considerable degree from the Catholic University, from the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. So those are actually familiar faces. And these are the faces of Ukrainian Maidan. I tell my students here when I teach my class on the Eastern Christianity, those are you there in Ukraine. These faces are your faces. A parallel could be definitely drawn between the Ukrainian theology of the Maidan and the Latin American theology of liberation. Indeed, the spirit, and I'm very close to finish, so no worries. Indeed, the spirit of civil protests, self-sacrifice, and the fight for a better society is something that is present in both theologies. But Ukrainian theology of the Maidan could perhaps be called better a theology of dignity. This message of irreducible human dignity is desperately needed in times of social upheaval. It brings the very core of the Christian message to every person and does this in a truly ecumenical way, which is very characteristic of the Ukrainian context. An Orthodox Christian here stands side by side with a Byzantine Rite and a Roman Rite Catholic and a Protestant. And we saw this on the example of clergy on the Maidan. Alas, I have the impression that we, in our ecumenical boardrooms and numerous ecumenical conferences devoted to Catholic Orthodox relations, are still not very far away from the level of medieval debates and quarrels about assigns and filioque. We are still making desperate attempts of revisiting the same old questions instead of looking into what is going on now before our eyes in Eastern Christianity. And I'm saying this as someone who has spent so much time of his career conducting research exactly on these medieval controversies that are, of course, a fascinating part of history. But this is not what we should think about today. Things like the Ukrainian theology of dignity, those are things that we need. This is thought-provoking. This is interesting. This is inspiring. This is a living reality that can bring hope to Christianity, not only in Eastern Europe, but also worldwide. The Patriarch of Constantinople, in his recent decision, has shown that he understands and appreciates this. Thank you.
Thank you. At the Nanovic Institute, it's customary for students to ask the first question. And we can involve graduate students in that category. Go ahead. Thank you.
Do we know if any clergy leaders of the Moscow Patriot were on Maidan? Can you repeat the question for the recording, please? Oh, sorry. Do we know if any clergy or leaders of the Moscow Patriot were at Maidan?
Go ahead.
Should I? Not the leaders, but there were a few priests of the Moscow Patriarchate there. It should be said that the leadership at that time, actually the head of the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, the late Metropolitan Volodymyr Sabodan, was actually someone who who had the views very different from the views of the present day leadership of this church, and he actually supported Ukrainian independence very much, although very cautiously. He didn't want to have conflict with Moscow, of course, but with him and under him, there were a number of actually very bright people among those who served the church. For instance, the spokesman of the church, Father, maybe Professor Yury helps me with the name. Kovalenko. Father, of course, Hovorun, yeah, of course. Father Kovalenko actually supported the Maidan and the idea of the civil society. And of course, Father Cyril Hovorun, whom I'm very much recommend to everyone who is interested, that should be the #1 reading on contemporary Ukrainian affairs. And he is an archimandrite of the Moscow Patriarchate, so of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. But he was one of those who spoke in support of the protests.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that Volodymyr Sabodan did not only was not only in support of the Ukrainian aspirations in the second Maidan, but also in the first Maidan as well. And Father Hovorun and I had a common mentor, actually, going back. But there were also several hierarchs in Ukraine in the Moscow Patriarchate who opposed Russian aggression in Eastern Ukraine. There was Igor of Cherkasy, the Bishop of Cherkasy, the Bishop of Vinnytsia, Simeon. He has been conducting services in Ukrainian language and liturgy in Ukrainian language, and has been opposed to Russian aggression. And even Onufri had insisted that Crimea remain part of Ukrainian Orthodox Church jurisdiction. As we speak today, all of the clergy in Crimea are part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church jurisdiction. So there are obviously very much pro-Putin hierarchs in Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate. I don't know if it's majority or what they call a silent minority, but there's also a number of critics, and so we shouldn't just discount Moscow Patriarchate, Ukrainian Orthodox Church as entirely the stooge of Putin somehow. That would be a very dangerous, slippery slope on which to start a dialogue to unify Ukrainian Church. Thank you.
Sure. And if I may just add as a clarification, so that to avoid the misunderstanding, when I in my talk spoke about the Moscow Patriarchate, I spoke predominantly about the church, the leadership of the church in Moscow. I did not speak about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Yeah. But they are, in a certain sense, of course, somehow dependent, and regrettably, they are often seen as, by some people in Ukraine, maybe by many people in Ukraine, as representatives of this Leviathan in Kremlin in Moscow.
Should I use a microphone, or should I just project? Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Well, thanks for everyone, all the participants. I learned quite a lot. My question's not for anyone in particular, but I'm just interested about where you see the place of the papacy in all of this. I heard somewhere that Pope Francis had expressed some sort of support for Moscow in all of this. I'm not sure if that's true. If it is, I'd also be interested to know about the ramifications of any such expression of support for the relationship between the Church in Rome and the Ukrainian Catholic Church.
So I've heard something like this about Pope Francis as well, but I think Pope Francis has remained very neutral about this, and some people in Ukraine would like him to become less neutral, because his silence on the issue has been very interesting. He's willing to talk about, you know, every single issue there is on the globe, and talking about the airplane and so on, but to talk about, you know, lives of people, that's something that he needs to make an opinion about. There has been earlier some rumors that the idea of Ukrainian national church will include all liturgically Orthodox, meaning that the Catholics who have the Eastern Rite will be joined in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church should be independent from Moscow, but also from Vatican. Ukraine should have full independence from all outside forces, you know, from Moscow and Vatican alike. And when those things were raised, I think there was some kind of a cautious statement from Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church against this idea. But again, I can't fully say like how far did this go. I think this was just a rumor. But maybe part of the silence of Pope Francis is to look at how the Ukrainian Greek Catholic community will look at this idea of total independence. Like, should Ukraine and its national church have total independence from outside influence? So yeah, I'll give floor to other members of the panel.
Maybe I would add that, of course, we should clearly see and be aware of the fact that the Vatican politics in the course of the 20th century, practically of the entire 20th century, and now it looks also in the 21st century, is very much centered on Moscow. Ostpolitik des Vatikans, the Ostpolitik of the Vatican, has been traditionally, at least since 1920s, I would say, very much centered on Moscow. Well, there are different approaches, different views on this among Catholic Christians and intellectuals. Of course, Ukrainians are not very happy about this, particularly about the silence of Pope Francis concerning the very phenomenon of the Maidan, of the revolution dignity. He practically has been silent about this. And this, of course, regrettable. This, of course, regrettable.
Let's have Ole first, and then this gentleman over here.
I would like to add some aspects about this question to position of Catholic Church to this conflict and to this situation in Ukraine. First of all, Pope Francis, after the decision of Bartholomew, met Metropolitan Ilarion, the foreign minister of Moscow Patriarchate, and Pope tell that he recognized only one patriarch in Moscow. Ilarion interpreted this sentence like the Vatican recognized only Moscow in this so-called canonical territory. But Pope doesn't speak about territory. Pope speak only about patriarch in Moscow. And this is some question which Moscow tried to speculate and to interpret a little bit on others to the meaning of Pope. Then next aspects about the this idea of unity, all Christian of old Kievan tradition. In official ecumenical conception of Greek Catholic Church, this church proclaimed that the Greek Catholic Church is open to contact with another churches and to find some new model to be together without to break the relation each of contemporary existent jurisdiction with another churches, with Rome, with Constantinople, and with Moscow too. It's not mean that Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church now is ready to join to this new jurisdiction of Constantinople, but officially Greek Catholic leader Sviatoslav Shevchuk said that for Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is really important, and we recognize and we happy with every step to unite the Ukrainian Christian in Ukraine and to bring more understanding between Christians in Ukraine. The Greek Catholic Church see this next development as a next level for future better relation in Ukraine between different denominations.
Thank you. So I want to address this question to the first speaker, because after I heard your presentation, I thought to myself, well, that's very clear cut. And then I heard the third speaker, and now I don't know what to think. So I just want to ask, have you thought at all about the reconciliation of the idea of unification of the whole church, and yet the accusation brought up by the third speaker that the Russian Orthodox Church has some malintent towards their use of power in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question. So I think it goes back to the reality here that this is not just an issue between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Church in Ukraine. It's an issue for all the Orthodox churches to resolve. So this is an issue of unity within Orthodoxy, unity through the Eucharist, and that's why I quoted extensively from the encyclical or the agreement between the Serbian and the Antiochian patriarchs as an example of this. Unfortunately, we're all sinful human beings, and the concern about the too close of an affiliation between the political authority in Moscow with the Orthodox Church hierarchy is well taken. But I would also say that what I'm hearing here is the same intense ethnocentrism going on in Ukraine. It goes on here in the United States. I'm a convert to Orthodoxy. I'm an American. I gave up any of my American identity to become Orthodox. I didn't want to become Ukrainian or Greek or Romanian, but that's almost the demand that's made upon us as Orthodox Christians in this country, because no one, including the Ecumenical Patriarch, will not deal with this. The Ecumenical Patriarch is responsible for an enormous amount of Hellenizing of the church in the West, insisting on a lot of Greek in the liturgy, so it's closing it off to a lot of people who are interested in the Orthodox experience. Now, to the extent that the Ukrainian Orthodox that are in schism with Russia are actually bringing modern Ukrainian into the liturgy, that's a good thing. The Russians need to do this too. Now, the problem is they have a history of a reform movement that was tainted by the Bolsheviks in the 1920s, which affected the introduction of modern Russian into the Orthodox liturgy. So there's a lot of paranoia and so forth that's fairly characteristic amongst the Eastern churches. My experience has been more with Romania. The issue of the authority over Moldova, for example, that's part of Romania. This was a standard policy on the part of Stalin to move Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic people into different parts of the Soviet Union so he would have this kind of opportunity to push this agenda. Now, to the extent that the Russian Orthodox hierarchy is involved in this, shame on them. But it still has to come back to a working out of these issues through the conciliar process. This is the way the Orthodox Church has always worked this out. And to the extent, and so you can't just undo the relationships that Antioch, that Alexandria, the Jerusalem Patriarchate, the Romania, Serbia, et cetera, have with the existing, with Moscow. I mean, it would just, this is the problem with the Ecumenical Patriarch. He's basically trying to force people to choose sides. And that's not, I don't think, necessary. Now, if he responds, hopefully he'll respond in a positive way, but he can't make these decisions unilaterally. He is not like a Roman pontiff. This is a very different kind of church structure. Thank you for the opportunity to clarify that.
We just have a few more minutes, and I feel like this is just starting to get interesting in some ways. Yes, we'll take your question, but I think one thing that I would like to ask too, just for points of clarification, it might be good for Mr. Ivanov or to anyone on the panel to talk briefly about the status of the Orthodox Church in Russia under the Soviet Union, and whether it's possible to understand divisions in the Moscow Patriarchate today in Russia in light of the living church, the renovated church, which the Soviet Union tried to establish. Yep. And then, so that may be enough to get you started. And then we'll take a last question from this gentleman
here. Andre probably has more expertise in this, but I just to say that there's also the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, which is now back in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, and they were completely separated for 70 years, and the structure is completely bizarre, but at least we're back in communion between those elements, and so that's. It may take another 100 years to have it somehow regularized completely. Things in Orthodox time are measured as you would the movement of a glacier. And this is before global warming.
Yeah, I just want to mention when the revolution happened and the Russian Orthodox Church sort of was dissolved as a state entity within the Russian Empire, two movements emerged in Russia. One was the official Moscow Patriarchate, or they called as official because the Soviets didn't recognize them as official. And the second one was called the Renovationists. So Renovationists were these Reform Orthodox priests who shaved their beards, open to women ordinations and so on. And they were very, very sort of forward-looking, progressive on many fronts. Now they went into dialogue with Gregory VII, with Constantinople. And Constantinople essentially went into Moscow and recognized the Renovationists without consulting with Tikhon. And Tikhon, the Moscow Patriarch, was appalled by essentially Constantinople's aggression into Moscow by working with the Renovationists. Renovationists were considered to be these liberal schismatics. I mean, they were very progressive, as I mentioned earlier. But the fact that Constantinople had intervened and worked with them was something that Moscow could not forgive. And then Moscow Patriarchate actually and Renovationists, both of them were all sent to Gulag after about 1929. And the church was essentially just ceased to exist until 1944 when Stalin had restored the Moscow Patriarchate and gave official sanction to that. And after that, after 1944, up until 1991, the Russian Orthodox Church was essentially, in the Soviet Union, was essentially the creature or the creation of Stalin and Soviet apparatus, and there was nobody. I mean, there were some catacomb believers and so on, but Constantinople from that period on worked with Moscow Patriarchate and not with other groups. So that's the Soviet period.
And even as late as 1981, right, there was a Council of Church Affairs in the Soviet Union that, ordered the people in the Russian church to issue proclamations in defense of government policies.
Oh, they
so
did.
The price that they paid was really...
The liturgies served for Stalin, so, you have the services for Stalin, you have Stalin in every sermons. I mean, just look up Journal Moskovской Patriarchии from 1945, 1946. It's Stalin on every page, Stalin in every liturgy and everything like that. So, yeah. Yeah, but not Khrushchev, because Khrushchev started anti-religious campaign. So Khrushchev was considered to be the heretic, but not Stalin, because Stalin was supporting, he converted, so to speak, in 1943. There's a long story about his conversion, but yeah, Stalin restored and rebuilt a lot of Orthodox churches, and then Khrushchev demolished them. So anyway.
Yes. So I just had a comment mostly for Professor Hinshaw, is that I'm an Orthodox Christian, but I'm an American. Greek by ancestry, but we're talking my great-grandparents here. And I've always noticed that in some ways, were it not for me being Orthodox, I probably could care less if, Russia re-annexed all of Ukraine as American. That's not much different to me, sorry to say. But in one respect, I've noticed in America is that even with the ethnic divisions and the issues with that, there's also, I've felt personally, a lot of closeness. It may be that a lot of churches in the Greek Archdiocese still use Greek, but a lot of those parishes have a lot of people who just came over from Greece, and they don't speak English. Trust me, I've tried. But at the same time, I only go to the Greek Orthodox Church in town because that's a 2-minute drive on Sunday morning, and the Serbian church is 20 minutes, so you do the math. In some ways, wouldn't the solution be, if you want to be under Patriarch Filaret, you're there, and if you don't like it, go to the parish across the street. You're both in Kiev, but isn't a multiplicity of jurisdictions, even though that seems bizarre to Orthodox context, and yes, is against canons that are a dead letter. We've done that in America for 100 years, and it would seem, why not just split it up? We're all, like the people, 1/3 of the people in that survey, we're all, at the end of the day, just Orthodox.
I think that's the Assembly of Bishops. There was an attempt to do something like this in preparation for the Great and Holy Council in 2016, in the traditionally non-Orthodox countries. And that would work as long as there was only one bishop in a local jurisdiction. The problem is that we have multiple bishops in the same place. And that is what is the heresy of Philetism. Multiple ethnic jurisdictions with different bishops representing those. So we have conflicts. I teach in Romania every year, and we have Romanian bishops assigned to Serbian territory, which creates a huge struggle between these two countries in terms of just cooperating. So it's not just in the problem here, it's throughout the Orthodox world, unfortunately.
Maybe I just would like to add that from my point of view, the fact of the coexistence of different jurisdictions in Ukraine has been a positive factor because it created an ecumenical atmosphere in the country and contributed to it. So in this sense, of course, the political attempts to forcefully unite all Orthodox into a single jurisdiction is, of course, not the right way to deal with these problems. So, yeah, and the presence of various jurisdictions actually is a factor that very often creates an atmosphere of forced ecumenism. It's so often that the churches are not very prone to ecumenism until they are not forced into it. So at least in Eastern Europe, And so this, we have to do with such a case in Ukraine.
Now, this situation that you described actually already exists. The compromise has been made in Estonia. Estonian Apostolic Church, which is the Orthodox Church under Constantinople, had seceded in 92 to 96. They had a secession from Moscow. They seceded from Moscow and formed their own Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church. They were not recognized by Moscow, and Alexei Ridiger, the Patriarch of Moscow, was going to anathemize and excommunicate them. And then he decided, Alexei, that he's going to go and make a deal. You know, the art of the deal, right? So he and Constantinople Patriarch, they actually got together and they said, we're going to recognize both churches in Estonia. So in Estonia, you can go to a Moscow Patriarchate Church or Constantinople Patriarchate Church, and both churches are recognized by both Moscow and Constantinople. So this is something that could work in a country that was not officially Orthodox, like Estonia. The question is, how is that going to work in Ukraine? And theoretically it could work where you could have a Moscow Patriarchate Ukrainian Church, and then you could have a Constantinople Patriarchate Ukrainian Church, and they could just coexist. It would, of course, it will require the will of the leaders in Ukrainian Orthodox community to do that. And so far, a lot of leaders, like including Filaret Denisenko and including Anufri, have been all about personal ambition, and it's either me or nobody else, and it's either me or nobody else will lead the church. And so that's something that, you have a concrete deal that could be made. You could make a deal, but then what do you do with personal ambitions of several hierarchs who want to become the patriarchs of Ukraine, and they don't want to give up that ambition? So that's the question.
I'm going to have to play the part of the patriarch, and thank you all for your participation and for your questions.